You need to leave. This hospital is for registered patients only." The words didn't echo, they cut, sharp and practiced, like policy memorized instead of compassion learned. Naomi Carter stopped mid-step in the center of the emergency lobby, her sneakers barely making a sound against the polished tile, her reflection faint beneath her feet as if even the floor wasn't sure what to make of her presence, and for a moment the room kept moving around her, nurses passing, a stretcher rolling somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeping in a steady rhythm that didn't belong to her, but it pulled her anyway, dragged her backward through time without asking permission, because she had heard that sound before, years ago, when she was 17 and standing in this exact building, though it had been colder then, louder in a different way, her father lying on a narrow bed with his hand gripping hers just a little too tight as a voice nearby had said, "No insurance means he'll have to wait," like it was a scheduling issue and not a human life, and Naomi hadn't understood how time could suddenly become something you had to qualify for, how minutes could be reserved for some and withheld from others, but she understood the look on the doctor's face, the quick glance, the dismissal, the way another patient had been rushed past them, well-dressed, urgent, important in a way her father apparently wasn't, and now here she was again, older, quieter, standing in the same air that once felt too thin to breathe, and the receptionist in front of her didn't see any of that history, didn't see the years built on top of that moment, only saw a woman in a plain black t-shirt and jeans and decided in less than a second exactly where she belonged, which in this case was nowhere near the care desk. "Do you even have coverage?" the woman asked, folding her arms like the answer had already been decided, and Naomi didn't respond, not right away, because she had learned something about silence over the years, learned that it wasn't empty, it was space, space that made people reveal who they really were, and around them the lobby began to shift just slightly, a young intern near the back, glancing up from a tablet, hesitating, sensing something that didn't match the script unfolding in front of him, while a security guard stepped closer, his presence not aggressive but firm in a way that assumed compliance before conversation. "I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," he said, reaching just enough to make the message clear, and that was when Naomi finally moved, not away, but forward, just a fraction. Enough to change the balance in the room, her eyes lifting to meet his, steady, unreadable, carrying a weight he couldn't quite place, and for a split second something in his posture shifted, uncertainty brushing against routine, but the receptionist pushed through it, her voice sharper now, louder. "We don't have time for this," she said, and that word, time, landed differently this time, because Naomi remembered exactly what it had cost her before, and the monitor beeped again somewhere down the hall, and she could almost see her father's hand slipping from hers, feel that moment stretch and snap all at once, and when she spoke, her voice wasn't raised, wasn't emotional, it was precise, measured, controlled in a way that didn't ask for permission. "Go ahead," she said quietly, looking at the guard's hand, "touch me again," and the air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the intern took a step forward, enough that two people in the waiting area looked up at the same time, enough that the routine began to fracture at the edges. Because Naomi Carter hadn't come back to ask for care, she had come back for something else entirely, and no one in that room understood yet just how much was about to shift. The guard did not move his hand right away, but he did not pull it back either, and that hesitation was enough to ripple through the room like a quiet crack in something that had always felt unbreakable, while Naomi Carter stood exactly where she was, as if the floor itself had anchored her there, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, and yet everything about her presence now carried weight that had not been there seconds ago. The receptionist shifted behind the desk, tapping her fingers against the counter with impatience. "That sounded louder than it should have. We are not doing this today," she said, her tone tightening as if control was something she could simply reclaim by raising her voice a fraction higher. But Naomi did not respond. She only turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting past the desk toward the hallway where the sound of that monitor continued its steady rhythm, and for a brief moment the present blurred again because she could see it clearly now, the narrow bed, the thin blanket, the way her father had tried to smile even as the room moved around him without stopping. "It is just a delay," someone had said back then, as if delay was harmless, as if waiting did not have consequences, as if time was not something that could run out. And Naomi remembered how she had stood there counting seconds without realizing she was counting something far more fragile than patience, and when she blinked the memory snapped away, replaced by fluorescent lights and the low hum of a hospital that had not changed. nearly as much as it should have. I am going to need you to cooperate, the guard said again, but his voice had softened not out of kindness but uncertainty, because something about her refusal to react the way he expected had unsettled the rhythm he relied on. The intern took another step closer now, his tablet lowered slightly, his eyes moving between Naomi and the front desk like he was trying to solve a problem that had no clear instructions. I think maybe we should just check the system, he offered carefully, but the receptionist cut him off immediately. There is nothing to check, she said too quickly. If she had coverage it would already be on file. And there it was again, that assumption delivered with confidence instead of confirmation. Naomi let out a slow breath, not heavy, not dramatic, just controlled and deliberate, like someone measuring time instead of losing it. And then she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, her thumb tapping the screen once before lifting it to her ear. "Akala," she said calmly, her voice low enough that only those closest could hear, and yet it carried further than it should have. "I am inside." There was a pause, not on her end but on the other side of the line, and whatever response came back did not change her expression. "Yes," she continued, "it is exactly the same." The receptionist scoffed at the sight, shaking her head as if she had seen this before, as if this was just another attempt to create leverage where there was none. "If you are calling someone to complain, you can do that outside," she said dismissively, but Naomi did not look at her. She did not acknowledge the comment at all, because she was already somewhere else, not physically but strategically, and the intern noticed it first, the shift not in her stance but in the room itself, like something unseen had just been set in motion. "Begin full audit," Naomi said into the phone, each word spaced with intention. "I want everything live." The guard frowned slightly, glancing toward the desk, then back at Naomi, unsure whether to intervene or step back because the situation no longer fit the script he had been trained to follow. And across the lobby a nurse paused mid-step, looking toward the front desk as if she had just received a notification she did not expect. The receptionist blinked once, her confidence flickering for the first time. "What is she talking about?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else, but the intern was already looking down at his tablet again, his eyes scanning the screen as lines of data began to refresh faster than normal, his brow tightening as recognition slowly replaced confusion. "Wait," he said under his breath, not loud enough to stop anyone but enough to change the direction of the moment, because Naomi Carter was no longer just a woman standing in the lobby. She was something else entirely, something the system itself had just acknowledged, even if the people in the room had not caught up yet. And when she lowered the phone from her ear, she did not explain, she did not announce, she simply looked back at the desk, her gaze steady, her voice even. "Now we wait." And for the first time the hospital did not feel like a place that controlled outcomes. It felt like a place about to answer for them. The word wait settled into the room like a challenge no one had agreed to accept, and yet no one moved to reject it either, as if the space itself had paused mid-breath. The receptionist glanced toward the nearest terminal, her fingers hovering above the keyboard before pressing a key with more force than necessary. The screen flickered once, then again, not dramatically but enough to draw her attention away from Naomi and onto the system she trusted more than her own judgment. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice lower now, not softer but less certain, while Naomi did not answer because the answer was already unfolding in front of them, and it did not need explanation. The intern's tablet refreshed again, lines of information reorganizing themselves with a speed that did not belong to routine checks. His eyes moved quickly, scanning, then stopping, then scanning again, as if the system had just revealed something that did not match the narrative he had been watching play out. "There is a flag," he said slowly, unsure if he should say it out loud, unsure if saying it would make it more real. The guard shifted his weight, glancing toward the desk again. "What kind of flag?" he asked. But the intern did not respond immediately, because the label on the screen was not something he had been trained to interpret in a moment like this. And across the lobby another nurse looked down at her own station, her brow tightening as she tapped through menus that were suddenly behaving differently than expected. The receptionist shook her head, dismissing it before fully understanding it. "System glitch," she said quickly, clinging to the first explanation that preserved control. "It happens sometimes." But even as she said it, the tone did not hold the same confidence it had just minutes earlier, because glitches did not spread across terminals this fast, and they did not carry access codes that overrode standard protocols. Naomi watched it all without moving, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already seen this moment long before it arrived. And in a way she had, because years ago she had stood in this same building watching a different kind of system fail, not digital but human, not coded but conditioned, and she remembered how every second had felt heavier than the last, how each delay had been explained away with calm voices and practiced phrases until explanation turned into outcome and outcome turned into something that could not be reversed. The memory did not rush her, it did not break her composure, it sharpened it, because this time she was not counting seconds, she was controlling them. The guard said again, but now the word sounded different, less directive, more uncertain, like a question he did not know how to finish. And Naomi finally looked at him fully, her expression calm but unyielding. "You should step back," she said evenly, not as a threat, not as a suggestion, but as a statement that assumed compliance rather than requesting it, and for a brief moment he hesitated again, longer this time, before taking a small step away, not because he had been ordered to, but because something told him he was no longer standing on stable ground. Behind the desk, the receptionist's screen refreshed once more and then froze, a message appearing that she had never seen before. Her fingers hovered again, but this time they did not move. "What is this?" she whispered under her breath, as if the words might disappear if she did not say them too loudly. The intern stepped closer, now unable to stay back any longer, his voice quiet but clear. "That is not a glitch," he said, pointing to the header on his tablet. "That is an executive override." The words hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said so far, because they did not accuse, they did not argue, they simply redefined the situation entirely. The receptionist turned toward Naomi, then her eyes narrowing, not with confidence but with confusion. "You said you were here for care," she said, grasping for something that still made sense. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the smallest movement but enough to shift the focus back to her completely. "I did not say that," she replied calmly, and the distinction landed harder than any raised voice could have, because it exposed the assumption that had guided every interaction from the moment she walked in. The nurse across the lobby took another step toward the desk, now her voice cautious. "We are getting system-wide alerts," she said. "Everything is being audited in real time." The guard looked between them, all his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that whatever this was, it was no longer something he could manage with routine instruction. And Naomi let the silence settle again, just long enough for the realization to begin forming in their minds before she spoke once more, her voice steady, her words precise. "You delayed care once before," she said. Not loudly but clearly enough that the intern looked up sharply. The receptionist froze and the nurse stopped mid-step, because suddenly this was not just about a system override or a procedural error. It was something older, something deeper, something that had been waiting for this exact moment to be addressed. And Naomi took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the room feel smaller. This time, she continued, her gaze unwavering, "You will not control the outcome." And for the first time since she walked through those doors, the hospital did not feel like a place where decisions were made. It felt like a place where decisions were about to be judged. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty, it felt loaded, like something unseen had just taken its place at the center of the room and no one knew how to move around it. The receptionist's confidence had not disappeared completely, but it had shifted, turning brittle at the edges as she straightened her posture and forced a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. "You are making this sound like something it is not," she said quickly, reaching for control the only way she knew how, through tone, through dismissal, through routine. "We follow procedures here, that is how this works." But even as she spoke, her screen refreshed again, and this time it did not freeze, it changed entire sections of the interface, reorganizing permissions, unlocking tabs she had never accessed before. Her hand pulled back slightly as if the keyboard itself no longer belonged to her. The intern leaned in closer, now unable to hide his reaction, his voice dropping as he read the header again, slower this time. "Executive level audit active," he said, and the words carried farther than intended because the nurse across the room stopped completely, turning toward them with a look that had shifted from curiosity to concern. "That should not be running from this terminal," she said, stepping closer, her tone careful but unmistakably different from before, because now she was not just observing, she was evaluating. And the guard who had stepped back earlier now found himself standing to the side rather than in front, his role quietly repositioned without anyone formally acknowledging it. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, but the environment around her continuing to adjust as if the system itself recognized something the people had not yet accepted. And for a moment she allowed the memory to surface again, not as a distraction but as a reminder. She saw the hallway as it had been years ago, the same lighting, the same quiet urgency that never quite reached her father. In time she remembered how she had looked at every face, hoping someone would choose differently, hoping someone would override the delay that had been assigned to them, as if care could be scheduled like an appointment instead of delivered when it mattered. And she remembered the moment she stopped hoping, not out of anger but clarity, because that was the moment everything shifted for her, not in that building but inside her. And now, standing in the same place, she was no longer asking for a different outcome, she was creating one. The receptionist said again, but this time the word sounded uncertain, almost cautious, like she was testing it. "Instead of using it, if there is some kind of mistake, we can resolve it through the proper channels." And Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes directly, and the look she gave her was not hostile, it was precise, like someone who had already measured the situation and found it lacking. "This is the proper channel," she said evenly, and the simplicity of the statement landed heavier than explanation ever could, because it did not argue, it defined the moment on her terms. The intern swallowed quietly, his eyes moving back to his screen where more data continued to populate, names, timestamps, internal reports appearing one after another, faster than he could process them all. "This is pulling Historical logs, he said, his voice tightening slightly. Not just today, everything. The nurse stepped beside him, now her own station reflecting the same cascade of information, her fingers hovering as if unsure whether she should interact with it at all. Who authorized this? She asked, but the question did not carry accusation anymore, it carried something closer to realization. The guard looked toward Naomi again, his earlier posture gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that whatever authority he thought he held did not apply here anymore, and Naomi let that understanding settle before she spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a weight that filled the space. Without rising, "You asked if I had coverage," she said, her gaze moving briefly across the desk then back again. "You asked if I belonged here." She paused just long enough for the words to register fully, not rushed, not dragged out, just placed exactly where they needed to be. Or what you should have asked, she continued, was who decides that? The receptionist's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out because the answer had already begun to reveal itself, not through argument but through the system that now surrounded them, responding in real time to a command she could not override. Across the lobby, a second nurse approached, drawn by the alerts, her voice low but urgent. "Administration just got notified," she said. "They are saying this is a full executive sweep." The intern looked up at Naomi again, his expression no longer confused but searching, as if trying to connect something he had seen before with the person standing in front of him. "Your name," he said slowly, "it is attached to the override." The room shifted again, not physically but perceptually, like a lens had just come into focus, revealing details that had always been there but never acknowledged, and Naomi took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to make it clear she was no longer being processed, she was directing what happened next. "You delayed him," she said quietly, not looking at any one person but speaking into the space itself. "You measured his time and decided it was worth less." The nurse near the intern froze, her hand still above the screen. The receptionist's shoulders stiffened. The guard looked down briefly, then back up, unsure where to place himself in this moment, and Naomi's voice did not rise. It did not need to, because the truth in it carried farther than volume ever could. "Today," she added, her gaze steady, her tone unshaken, "we measure something else." And in that instant the hospital was no longer a place that filtered people through policy, it was a place being forced to confront the cost of those policies in real time, with no way to look away. The room did not return to normal after her last words. It shifted further, as if something invisible had crossed a line that could not be undone. The receptionist swallowed hard, her fingers finally leaving the keyboard completely, as though touching it now might make things worse instead of better. "This is unnecessary," she said, but the statement lacked structure, it lacked authority, it sounded like something said to fill space rather than control it. And Naomi Carter noticed that shift immediately, because she had built her entire life recognizing the moment when confidence stopped being real and started being performed. The intern's screen continued to populate, now showing archived reports, flagged complaints, internal notes that had never surfaced in daily operations. His eyes widened slightly as he scrolled slower, this time absorbing what was in front of him instead of just reacting to it. "There are multiple entries," he said quietly, "of delayed intake cases. Flagged but unresolved." The nurse beside him leaned in closer, her voice tightening as she read over his shoulder. "Some of these go back years." And that word years did not just sit in the air, it connected something, it stretched backward, linking the present moment to something that had never truly been closed. The guard shifted again, but this time he did not look at Naomi first. He looked at the screens, then at the staff, then back at her, as if recalibrating his understanding of who he was dealing with, and more importantly what this situation actually was. "Maybe we should call administration," he said, but the nurse shook her head slightly. "They are already aware," she replied. "This override is above department level." The receptionist straightened again, trying to reclaim some version of control, but her movements were slower, now more calculated, like she was stepping on unfamiliar ground. "Even if that is true," she said carefully, "there are protocols for this kind of review. You cannot just walk in." "And I did not walk in," Naomi interrupted calmly, not raising her voice, not cutting her off sharply, just placing the words exactly where they belonged. "I returned." The correction was small, but it shifted the meaning entirely, because returning implied history, returning implied unfinished business, returning implied that what was happening now had been set in motion long before this moment. The intern looked up again, his expression no longer uncertain but searching, as if he was trying to align what he was seeing on the screen with the person standing in front of him. "These reports," he said slowly, "they were reviewed but never escalated. The notes say insufficient priority." The nurse exhaled softly, her shoulders tightening as realization began to settle in. "Priority," she repeated under her breath, as if testing the word against what she was seeing, and Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward the monitors, then back to the people in front of her. "That word decides everything in a place like this," she said evenly. "Who gets seen first, who gets told to wait, who gets told to come back later." She paused just long enough for the weight of that to register before continuing, "And who does not get Seen it all, the receptionist opened her mouth again but stopped because there was nothing left that sounded convincing in the presence of what was unfolding around her. The guard looked down briefly, then back up, his voice lower, now almost respectful. If there was a mistake, he said carefully, we can correct it. Naomi met his gaze directly, her expression unchanged but her eyes sharper, now more focused. A mistake happens once, she said. This is a pattern. The intern nodded slightly without realizing it, his attention still fixed on the data scrolling in front of him. There are timestamps, he added, repeated delays, similar notes, same language used over and over. The nurse stepped back slightly, her hand covering her mouth for a brief second before lowering it again. This should have been addressed, she said quietly, and Naomi did not respond to that immediately because she had heard that sentence before, not in these exact words but in meaning, in tone, in the way people distance themselves from responsibility by acknowledging it too late. And for a moment the memory surfaced again, not sharply, not painfully, but clearly, her father's voice, weaker than she remembered yet steady enough to reassure her even when he should not have had to. It is going to be okay, he had said, and she had believed him because she had needed to believe something in a place where everything else felt uncertain. And now, standing here years later, she understood what he had given her in that moment, not comfort but clarity, the kind that did not fade, the kind that shaped decisions long after the moment passed. Naomi took a slow step forward again, not aggressive, not hesitant, just deliberate, closing the space between her and the desk until there was no distance left to hide behind. You asked about coverage, she said, her voice calm, her words precise. You asked if I belonged here. Her gaze moved across each of them briefly, not lingering, just acknowledging before returning to the center. The real question was never about me, she added, and the room seemed to hold still, waiting for the rest of the sentence, because now they understood that what came next would define everything that had happened so far. It was about what you were willing to ignore, she finished, and the silence that followed was not uncertain anymore. It was heavy with recognition because the system had already answered that question, and now the people in the room were being forced to do the same without the option to look away. The silence after her words did not break, it deepened, as if every person in the room had just been handed something they could not put down. The receptionist looked at the screen again, but this time she was not searching for confirmation, she was searching for escape, her fingers hovering then retreating like the answers in front of her had become too clear to challenge. This does not change procedure, she said finally, but the sentence sounded rehearsed, like something she had said before in other moments where explanation replaced accountability, and Naomi Carter caught that instantly because she had heard that same tone years ago in different voices, different faces, but always carrying the same message that procedure mattered more than people. The intern scrolled further now, his breathing slower, more deliberate as he read through report after report, each one structured the same, each one ending with the same conclusion. Insufficient priority, they categorized them, he said quietly, almost to himself. They labeled who could wait. The nurse beside him nodded slowly, her expression tightening, not with confusion anymore but recognition, and once labeled, she added, the system just follows through. The guard shifted again, but now he was no longer standing between Naomi and the desk. He had moved slightly behind her line of presence without even realizing it, as if the role he had been playing no longer fit the reality unfolding around him. So what happens now, he asked, but the question was not directed at the staff anymore, it was directed at Naomi, and that shift did not go unnoticed. The receptionist straightened again, but there was no strength behind it this time, only habit. What happens now is we reset the system and move forward, she said quickly, trying to reclaim direction, but Naomi turned her head just enough to look at her, and the look itself was enough to stop the momentum of that statement before it could settle. You do not reset something you never acknowledged, she said evenly, and the words did not rise, they landed, each one placed with intention. The intern looked up again, his eyes locking onto Naomi, now fully aware that she was not reacting to the system, she was directing it. The override is still expanding, he said, it is pulling staff decisions, not just intake logs. The nurse's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the station. That means internal evaluations, she said, performance reviews, conduct notes, everything. The receptionist's composure cracked just slightly, her voice lowering without her permission. That is confidential, she said, but the statement no longer carried authority, it carried concern. Naomi did not respond to that immediately. She let the weight of the moment build because she understood something they did not yet fully grasp, that confidentiality had been used as a shield, not for protection but for concealment, and now that shield was gone, you documented everything, she said calmly, her gaze steady. You just never expected anyone to read it all at once. Across the lobby another alert chimed, this time louder, drawing attention from two additional staff members who stepped closer, their expression shifting from routine focus to unease as they checked their own terminals. It is system-wide, one of them said. Every department is being audited live. The guard exhaled slowly, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. This is not a review, he said, this is exposure. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward him, acknowledging the accuracy of the statement without Confirming it directly, the intern's voice came again, softer but clearer now. There is a name attached to every override layer. He said it is the same one across all access points. The nurse looked at him, then at Naomi, then back at the screen, her realization catching up in real time. Say it, she said quietly, not as a demand but as a need for clarity. The intern hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. Naomi Carter. The name settled into the room differently than anything else had before, because it was not just identification, it was alignment. It connected the person standing in front of them to the system they could no longer control. The receptionist blinked once, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disbelief. That is not possible, she said, but the words sounded weaker than the silence that followed. Naomi took a step forward, not dramatic, not forceful, just enough to remove any remaining distance between herself and the truth they were beginning to see. It is not supposed to be possible, she said evenly. That is the point. The nurse's shoulders lowered slightly as if the tension she had been holding finally had somewhere to go. You are not here for care, she said softly. Naomi met her gaze directly, her expression calm but resolute. No, she replied, I am here for accountability. The word did not echo, but it did not need to, because everything around them was already responding to it. The system, the staff, the space itself, shifting away from routine into something far more deliberate. And for the first time since Naomi had walked through those doors, the hospital was no longer operating on assumption, it was operating on truth, and truth did not wait for permission. The word accountability did not just settle into the room, it reshaped it, because once spoken it removed every comfortable distance the staff had been hiding behind. The receptionist took a step back almost unconsciously, her posture no longer squared to Naomi but angled slightly away, as if she needed space from what was unfolding. You cannot just come in here and take control like this, she said, but the argument had lost its structure. It sounded more like resistance than authority. Naomi Carter did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just enough to let the truth of that statement unravel on its own, because this was not about taking control, it was about revealing who already had it. The intern's hands hovered over his tablet again, but this time he was not scrolling, he was reading carefully, processing each entry as if each line carried weight beyond data. These are escalation blocks, he said quietly. They were manually suppressed. The nurse beside him inhaled slowly, her eyes scanning across the same information. That means someone chose not to act, she added, and her voice carried something new now, not just concern but accountability of her own, as if she was stepping into a realization she could no longer ignore. Across the lobby more staff had gathered, drawn not by noise but by the quiet intensity that now defined the space. Screens flickered in multiple directions, each one reflecting the same system-wide audit that no one could stop. The guard looked around, taking in the shifting dynamic, his role now reduced to observation rather than enforcement. This is bigger than intake, he said under his breath, and Naomi's gaze moved briefly toward him, acknowledging the statement without confirming it directly, because she did not need to. The system was already confirming everything for her. Who authorized these suppressions? The receptionist asked suddenly, her voice sharper now but not stronger, as if urgency could replace control. The intern hesitated, his eyes scanning a specific section before answering. It is tied to management level approvals, he said. Repeated approvals. The nurse stepped back slightly, her expression tightening. So it was not one decision, she said, it was a pattern of decisions. And Naomi took another small step forward, her presence now impossible to ignore, not because of volume or force but because of certainty. That is what patterns are, she said evenly. They are decisions repeated until they feel like policy. The words landed with precision because they reframed everything the staff had been relying on. Procedure was no longer neutral, it was revealed as a series of choices. The receptionist shook her head again, but slower this time, her resistance losing ground. You are twisting this, she said, but there was no conviction behind it now, just habit. No, Naomi replied calmly, I am reading it. The intern looked up again, his expression shifting from analysis to realization, as if something had finally aligned. There is a flagged case here, he said, his voice tightening slightly. It is marked as unresolved, but the notes, they match the language from today. The nurse leaned in quickly, her eyes moving across the screen. A delayed intake, insufficient coverage, recommendation to wait, she read, and then she stopped, her breath catching just slightly. This date, she added, her voice dropping, it is from years ago. The room seemed to contract around that detail, the past no longer separate from the present but fully connected. The receptionist looked at the screen, then at Naomi, her expression no longer defensive but searching. What are you saying? She asked, and for the first time the question did not come from a place of control, it came from a place of uncertainty. Naomi held her gaze steady, her voice calm but carrying the weight of something that had waited too long to be spoken. I am saying this is not new, she replied. I am saying you have seen this before. The intern's eyes widened slightly as he cross-referenced the data, his voice quieter now, almost careful. The name on the case, he said, hesitating for a moment before continuing. It matches your last name. The nurse turned toward Naomi fully now, her expression shifting into something deeper than concern, something closer to understanding. Carter. she said softly as if the connection had just clicked into place. Naomi did not nod, she did not confirm with gesture, she simply stood there letting the truth settle on its own because it did not need emphasis, it needed recognition. The guard exhaled slowly, his earlier uncertainty now replaced by clarity. You were here before, he said, not as a question but as a realization. Naomi's gaze moved across the room briefly, then returned to center, her voice steady, unwavering. I was, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any explanation could have. The receptionist looked down at the screen again, then back at Naomi, her voice barely above a whisper. Now that case, it was closed. Naomi's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened just slightly. No, she replied calmly, it was ignored. And the difference between those two words settled into the room with undeniable clarity, because one implied resolution and the other revealed truth, and for the first time since the audit began, no one in that space could pretend they did not understand which one they were looking at. The word ignored did not just land, it lingered, stretching across the room like something no one could step around, because now it was no longer about policy or procedure, it was about recognition. And the receptionist felt it first, her posture stiffening again, but this time not from authority, from exposure. That is not fair, she said quickly, her voice tightening as if fairness was something she could reclaim by saying it out loud. But Naomi Carter did not react to the defense, she did not correct it, she did not challenge it, she simply let it exist in the space long enough for everyone else to hear how fragile it sounded against the weight of what was now visible. The intern looked back down at the screen, his fingers moving slower, now more deliberate, as he opened the archived case fully. There are notes here, he said quietly. Initial intake delayed, verification requested, escalation recommended but never completed. The nurse leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing as she read the same lines. And the follow-up, she added, stopping for a moment before finishing, marked as resolved without action. The room shifted again, not physically but perceptually, because now the language itself was being questioned. The way words had been used to soften outcomes, to make decisions sound procedural instead of personal. Resolved, Naomi repeated softly, not as a correction but as an observation, and the difference in tone alone was enough to reframe the entire word. The guard glanced between them, his expression tightening as understanding continued to build. So it was documented but nothing changed, he said, and Naomi's gaze moved toward him briefly. Something changed, she replied calmly. The record did. The distinction settled heavily because it exposed the gap between documentation and reality. The nurse stepped back slightly, her shoulders lowering as if the realization had weight to it. We log everything, she said quietly, almost to herself, but logging is not the same as fixing. The intern nodded without looking up. And once it is logged, it looks like it was handled, he added, and that was the moment when the room stopped trying to defend itself and started recognizing what it had been doing. The receptionist exhaled slowly, her hands now resting flat on the desk as if she needed something steady beneath her. You are connecting this to your case, she said, her voice softer now, not dismissive, not defensive, just uncertain. Naomi met her gaze directly, her expression unchanged but her presence more defined than ever. I am not connecting it, she said evenly, it was already connected. The intern scrolled again, his eyes widening slightly as another section populated. There are similar cases, he said, same language, same delays, same outcome. The nurse looked at him, then back at the screen, her voice tightening. How many, she asked, and the intern hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. More than there should be. The answer did not give a number, but it gave something more important, it gave scale. The guard ran a hand across the back of his neck, his earlier certainty fully gone, now replaced by quiet realization. This is not one situation, he said, this is how it works. Naomi did not respond to that immediately. She let the statement settle because it was the first time someone in the room had said it without defense, without justification, without trying to soften it, and that mattered more than any immediate reaction. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady, that is exactly what this is. The nurse looked at Naomi again, her expression no longer questioning but understanding. And you came back for this, she said. Naomi held her gaze, her tone calm but grounded in something deeper than the moment. I came back because this did not end when the record closed, she replied. The receptionist looked down again at the screen, then back at Naomi, her voice barely above a whisper. Now your father, she said hesitantly as if the word itself carried weight. Naomi did not flinch, she did not look away, she simply stood there allowing the truth to exist without interruption. He waited, she said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement carried more than explanation ever could, because it was not just about time, it was about what that time represented. The intern's hand stilled completely on the tablet, his voice softer now, and the system said that was acceptable, he added, and Naomi's eyes met his directly. The system reflected what people decided was acceptable, she corrected, and that distinction shifted responsibility away from abstraction and back to the individuals in the room. The nurse inhaled slowly, her posture straightening, not with authority but with awareness. Then this is not just an audit, she said, this is a correction. Naomi did not nod, she did not confirm, she simply looked across the room at each of them one by one, her gaze Steady, her voice calm. This is a line being redrawn, she said, and the words did not echo, but they did not need to, because everyone in that space understood that once a line like that was drawn, it could not be moved back without consequence. And for the first time since Naomi had returned, the hospital was no longer operating under the assumption that things would continue as they always had. It was standing at the edge of something new, something that required more than procedure, something that required change, and Naomi Carter had not come back to suggest it. She had come back to make sure it happened. The words, a line being redrawn, did not fade. They settled into every corner of the room, reshaping not just the moment but the meaning of everything that had come before. And for a brief second no one spoke, because there was nothing left to soften, nothing left to reframe. The receptionist looked down at the terminal again, but this time she did not try to control it. She read it, her eyes moving slowly across the entries as if seeing them for the first time without the shield of routine. These were signed off, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Each delay, each closure, someone approved this. The intern nodded once, his voice steady, now grounded in what he could no longer ignore. There are authorization stamps attached to every case, he said, supervisor level, management level, sometimes higher. The nurse crossed her arms, but not defensively this time, more like she was holding onto something while the ground shifted beneath her. So the system did not fail, she said, it followed instructions. Naomi Carter's gaze moved across them all, her expression calm but unyielding. Systems do not decide, she said evenly, they reflect decisions. The guard exhaled slowly, his eyes dropping for a moment before lifting again. Then everyone here is part of it, he said, not accusing, not defensive, just stating what had become obvious. The receptionist looked at him quickly as if she wanted to deny it, but stopped herself because the screen in front of her would not support that argument anymore. We followed protocol, she said, but the words sounded different now, thinner, less certain. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice measured. Protocol is just a pattern written down, she replied. It only exists because someone keeps choosing it. The intern's screen updated again, a new alert appearing at the top, his eyes narrowing as he read it. There is a live escalation, he said. Executive review team is logging in. The nurse straightened slightly, her posture shifting not back to authority but toward awareness. That means this is no longer internal, she said, this is going higher. Across the lobby another terminal chimed, and then another, each one signaling the same thing, that this moment had moved beyond the room, beyond the staff, beyond anything they could contain. The receptionist stepped back fully now, her hands no longer on the desk, her voice quieter than it had been since Naomi arrived. What happens when they see this? She asked, not looking at anyone directly. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, because it was not really about the system anymore, it was about consequence, and consequence did not need to be announced to be understood. They will see what was already there, Naomi said finally, her tone steady. The difference is they will not be able to ignore it. The intern swallowed softly, his attention still fixed on the data. There are more cases loading, he said. Different departments, same patterns. The nurse shook her head slowly, her voice low. This is bigger than this floor, she said. This is everywhere in the building. The guard looked around the lobby again, the space that had once felt controlled now feeling exposed. People trusted this place, he said quietly, and Naomi's gaze met his directly. People still do, she replied. That is why this matters. The receptionist closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, her composure no longer forced, just gone, replaced by something more honest, something closer to recognition. We thought we were doing our jobs, she said softly. Naomi did not dismiss that, she did not contradict it, she simply answered with clarity. You were doing what you were taught to accept, she said. There is a difference. The intern looked up again, this time not at the screen, but at Naomi, fully understanding now that she was not here to argue, she was here to change the direction of everything. And now, he said slowly, we cannot go back to that. Naomi held his gaze, her voice calm but firm. No, she said, you cannot. The statement did not carry threat, it carried certainty, because some moments do not allow reversal once they are seen clearly enough. Across the lobby the doors opened and two individuals in formal attire stepped inside, their presence quiet but unmistakable, their attention immediately drawn to the terminals, to the staff, to Naomi standing at the center of it all. The nurse glanced toward them, then back at Naomi, her voice barely above a whisper. That is executive review, she said, and Naomi did not turn. She did not acknowledge them immediately, because this moment did not belong to their arrival, it belonged to the truth that had already surfaced. Good, Naomi said calmly, and the word did not signal relief, it signaled readiness, because everything that had been hidden, everything that had been labeled, everything that had been delayed was now visible, and visibility does not ask for permission, it demands response. And as the room shifted once more, not with tension but with inevitability, Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, not waiting, not reacting, but ensuring that this time nothing would be left unresolved. The presence of the executive review team did not interrupt the moment, it confirmed it, because the shift had already happened before they walked through the doors. Their arrival only made it visible to everyone else. The two individuals moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes scanning the terminals first, then the staff, then finally settling on Naomi Carter standing at the center of it all, and for a brief second something passed between them, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that does not need introduction. The receptionist straightened instinctively, her posture snapping back into place as if authority had just entered the room and she needed to align herself with it again. "We were just about to escalate this," she said quickly, her voice regaining structure as she gestured toward the screens, but one of the executives raised a hand slightly, not to silence her forcefully but to redirect the moment. "It has already been escalated," he said calmly, his tone measured, his focus never leaving the data in front of him. The intern stepped back slightly, giving space without being told, his eyes still fixed on the information as if stepping away would not disconnect him from what he had just seen. The nurse mirrored the movement, her attention shifting between the executives and Naomi as the dynamic in the room continued to realign. "Full audit is active across all departments," the second executive said after a brief glance at her tablet. "Override authority confirmed." The words landed differently now because they were no longer coming from within the room, they were being validated from above. The structure that had once felt untouchable was now responding to something it could not override. The guard lowered his gaze slightly, then lifted it again, his stance no longer defensive, no longer uncertain, just present, as if he understood his role had changed entirely. The receptionist opened her mouth to speak again but stopped when the first executive finally turned toward Naomi, fully his expression composed but attentive. "Miss Carter," he said, acknowledging her not with surprise but with clarity, "we have been reviewing the incoming data." Naomi did not nod, she did not step forward, she remained exactly where she was, her voice calm and steady. "Then you already know," she replied, and the statement was not a question, it was a continuation, because the truth did not need to be reintroduced, it needed to be acted on. The executive glanced back at the terminal briefly, then at his colleague before responding. "We know there are patterns that were not addressed," he said, carefully choosing each word with precision. "We know there were decisions that did not align with standard care expectations." Naomi's gaze did not shift, her tone remained even. "They aligned with what was accepted," she said, and the correction was subtle but exact because it reframed the issue from deviation to design. The nurse inhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a moment as the weight of that distinction settled. The intern looked between them, all his earlier uncertainty gone, replaced by quiet focus, as if he was witnessing something that would change how he understood this place permanently. "We are initiating immediate review of all flagged cases," the second executive added, "and suspending decision authority on any matching protocols until further notice." The receptionist's composure faltered again at that, her voice quieter now. "That will disrupt operations," she said, and the first executive turned toward her, not sharply, not dismissively, but with clarity. "Operations that produce these outcomes need to be disrupted," he replied, and there was no argument left in that statement because it was no longer theoretical, it was grounded in what they were all seeing. Naomi let the exchange settle before speaking again, her voice steady, her presence unchanged. "A disruption is not the problem," she said, "delay is." The words carried through the room with quiet force because they connected the present action to the past consequence without needing to explain it. The guard shifted slightly, his eyes moving toward Naomi, then to the executives. "So what happens to the people who made those decisions?" he asked, and the question hung in the air, not accusatory, not defensive, just necessary. The executives exchanged a brief glance, not hesitation but alignment before the first one answered. "Accountability will be determined through the review process," he said, but Naomi's gaze sharpened slightly, her voice still calm but more precise now. "Accountability is not a process," she said, "it is a response." The distinction landed immediately because it removed distance, it removed delay, it removed the comfort of time as a buffer. The intern looked back at the screen again as new updates continued to populate. "They are tagging responsible parties," he said quietly. "Every decision point is being traced." The nurse nodded slowly, her posture straightening, not out of authority but out of understanding. "Then nothing gets lost this time," she said, and Naomi met her gaze directly. "And nothing gets ignored," she corrected, and the word echoed differently now because it had already defined everything that had come before. The first executive stepped slightly closer now, his attention fully on Naomi. "You initiated this," he said, not as an accusation but as acknowledgement. "You forced visibility across the system." Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the weight of that recognition exist before answering with quiet clarity. "It was already there," she said. "I just made sure it could not be hidden anymore." And as the room settled into that truth, as the system continued to expose what had been buried, as the people within it began to understand the role they had played, the hospital was no longer reacting, it was being redefined in real time, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, not as a disruptor but as the point where everything finally aligned with what should have been there all along. The word aligned did not settle quietly, it shifted the entire tone of the room from exposure to consequence, because once something is aligned it demands action, and the executives understood that immediately. The first one stepped closer to the main terminal, his hand moving across the interface with practiced precision, not to override but to confirm what was already in motion. Flag all supervisory approvals tied to delayed intake classifications, he said calmly, and the system responded without hesitation. Lines of data reorganizing again, highlighting names, timestamps, decisions that had once been buried inside routine. The intern watched it unfold, his voice lower now but steady. It is mapping responsibility across departments, he said, not just who entered the data but who confirmed it, who ignored escalation, who signed off on closure. The nurse beside him nodded slowly, her eyes moving across the same information, her expression no longer uncertain but resolute. That means no one can say they did not know, she said, and Naomi Carter's gaze shifted slightly, acknowledging the statement, because that was always the turning point, not awareness but the removal of denial. The receptionist stood still behind the desk, her earlier resistance gone, replaced by something heavier, something that looked like recognition settling in layers. We were told to prioritize based on risk, she said quietly, not as a defense but as an explanation that had lost its certainty. Naomi turned toward her fully now, her voice calm but precise. Risk to who? She asked, and the question did not need elaboration because it exposed the imbalance immediately. The receptionist did not answer right away, her eyes lowering briefly as if the answer had always been there but had never been examined closely enough. The guard shifted his stance slightly, his attention fixed on the unfolding review, his voice low but clear. It was never equal, he said, and Naomi did not respond verbally. She did not need to because the system was already confirming that truth in real time. The second executive looked up from her tablet, her tone measured but firm. Immediate suspension of all intake classification protocols pending full review, she said. All patients will be processed under direct evaluation without delay filters until further notice. The nurse exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering, not from relief but from the realization of what that change meant. That will change everything, she said, and Naomi's gaze moved across the room, her voice steady. It should have from the beginning, she replied. The intern scrolled again, his eyes widening slightly as another layer of data appeared. There are internal notes here, he said, language patterns used to justify delays, repeated phrasing across multiple staff members. The first executive nodded once, his expression tightening slightly. Standardized bias embedded in documentation, he said, and the phrase did not accuse, it defined the issue with precision. The receptionist looked up again, her voice softer now, stripped of pretense. We thought we were following guidelines, she said. Naomi held her gaze, her tone even but unyielding. Guidelines do not remove responsibility, she said, they reveal how it is used. The guard looked toward the executives again, his voice steady. What happens to the supervisors who approved this? He asked, and the first executive did not hesitate this time. They will be removed from decision authority effective immediately pending investigation, he said, and the clarity in his response left no space for delay. The intern glanced up at Naomi again, his expression now one of understanding rather than confusion. This is not just about one case, he said, and Naomi met his gaze directly. It never was, she replied. The nurse stepped forward slightly, her posture straightening with purpose. Then we fix it now, she said, and Naomi's expression remained calm but her eyes sharpened just enough to reflect the weight of that commitment. No, she corrected gently, you change how it works so it cannot happen again. The distinction settled into the room because fixing implied repair but changing implied transformation, and transformation did not allow return. The receptionist placed her hands on the desk again, but this time not to control the space but to steady herself within it, her voice quiet but clear. We cannot undo what already happened, she said, and Naomi did not argue that, she did not soften it, she simply answered with truth. No, she said, but you can decide what happens next. The executives continued issuing directives quietly, efficiently, the system responding without resistance because the authority behind those commands was no longer being questioned. Across the lobby, staff members moved differently now, not with routine but with awareness, each action measured, each decision reconsidered, as if the standard they had been following had shifted beneath them, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it all, not raising her voice, not demanding attention but holding the line she had drawn, because for the first time the hospital was not just reacting to policy, it was redefining it, and the people inside it were no longer able to separate themselves from the impact of their decisions. They were part of it and now they were responsible for what came next. The shift from fixing to changing did not just stay in the room, it began to move through it like a current, touching every screen, every station, every person who had once relied on routine to guide them and now had to rely on something else. The first executive continued issuing directives without raising his voice, but every instruction carried weight because it was no longer about efficiency, it was about correction. Lock historical classification templates, he said calmly, and the system responded immediately. Removing access to the very language that had shaped so many past decisions, the intern watched the templates disappear from his interface, his voice quiet but steady. The categories are gone, he said. No more delayed intake labels, no more priority filters. The nurse exhaled slowly, her shoulders straightening as if something had just been lifted from the process itself. Then every patient gets evaluated as they are, she said. Naomi Carter's gaze moved across the room, her expression unchanged but her presence grounded in the outcome she had come to ensure. That is what should have always happened, she said evenly. The receptionist looked down at her station again, her hands resting near the keyboard but not touching it, as if she understood now that what she had been trained to use was no longer valid. We built our flow around those filters, she said quietly, and Naomi turned slightly toward her, her voice calm but direct. You built your flow around assumptions, she replied, and the correction landed with clarity because it removed the idea that the system had been neutral. The second executive tapped her tablet again, her tone precise. All staff are required to complete immediate reauthorization training before resuming intake decisions, she said. No exceptions. The guard nodded slowly, his voice low but firm. That means no one continues like before, he said, and Naomi did not respond verbally. She allowed the statement to stand because it reflected exactly what had been set in motion. The intern scrolled again, though there was less to scroll now, fewer hidden layers, more visible clarity. The audit is compiling final reports, he said. Each department will have a direct accountability summary. The nurse looked at the screen, then back at Naomi, her voice quieter now but stronger in meaning. Then this becomes permanent, she said. Naomi met her gaze, her tone steady. It becomes standard, she corrected, because permanence implied duration but standard implied expectation, and expectation is what shapes behavior over time. Across the lobby, more staff had stopped what they were doing, not because they were told to but because they could feel the shift in how things were about to work. One of the nurses who had just arrived looked at the updated interface, her voice filled with disbelief. There are no shortcuts anymore, she said, and the first executive responded without hesitation. There never should have been. The receptionist closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, her composure no longer forced, no longer defensive. Just present. We thought we were managing volume, she said softly. Naomi's gaze remained steady, her voice calm but firm. You were managing perception, she said, not care. The distinction settled deeply because it revealed the difference between efficiency and responsibility. The guard looked around again, his earlier role now fully replaced by observation, his voice quiet but certain. This place is going to feel different after today, he said, and Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the room, acknowledging the truth of that statement. It has to, she replied. The intern's tablet chimed again, signaling the final stage of the audit, his voice carrying a quiet sense of completion. The system is locking the changes, he said. New protocols are now active. The nurse stepped forward slightly, her posture aligned not with authority but with purpose. Then we start from here, she said. Naomi did not nod, she did not confirm with gesture, she simply stood there, her presence steady, her voice measured. You continue from here, she corrected, and the difference mattered because she was not staying to oversee, she was ensuring that what had been set in motion would not depend on her presence to continue. The first executive turned toward her again, his expression composed but respectful. The board will be informed of all actions taken today, he said. This will not be reversed. Naomi met his gaze directly, her tone even. It should not need to be said, she replied. If it does, then nothing changed. The words landed with finality because they removed any illusion that this moment was optional. Across the room, the staff stood in a new kind of silence, not uncertain, not defensive, but aware of what had been exposed, aware of what had been removed, and aware of what was now expected of them. And Naomi Carter took a slow breath, not heavy, not emotional, just controlled, as if marking the end of something that had been waiting to be addressed for far too long. Before turning slightly toward the exit, her presence no longer a disruption but a standard that had been set because she had not come back to be heard. She had come back to make sure that this time nothing would be filtered, nothing would be delayed, and nothing would ever be ignored again. Naomi Carter did not rush her exit. She did not turn dramatically or look back for approval. She simply walked forward with the same steady pace she had carried from the moment she entered, and that alone shifted something in the room because no one stopped her, no one questioned her path. The receptionist watched her go, not with resistance but with a quiet awareness that the version of this place she had relied on no longer existed. The intern remained still for a moment longer, his eyes lingering on the now simplified interface where decisions would have to be made without filters, without shortcuts, without the quiet comfort of delay. And then he moved, not hesitantly but with intention, stepping toward the next patient waiting at the desk, his voice calm but different now. We will take care of you, he said, and for the first time those words did not sound procedural, they sounded present. The nurse beside him followed without needing instruction, her posture aligned with purpose rather than routine as she began reviewing cases that would no longer be pushed aside. The guard stood near the entrance, his role unchanged in title but transformed in meaning, his gaze scanning the lobby not for compliance but for fairness, as if he understood now that presence alone could Influence what happened next. Behind them, the executives continued their work, not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision, confirming that every directive issued would hold beyond this moment, beyond this room, beyond any individual who might have once shaped the system differently. And as Naomi reached the doors, she paused, not because she needed to, but because something in the air had shifted enough to mark the end of what had begun years ago. The sound of that monitor from the hallway no longer pulled her backward. It stayed where it belonged, in the past, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer controlling the present. She placed her hand lightly on the door handle, her reflection faint in the glass for just a second. And in that reflection there was no trace of the 17-year-old who had once stood in this building waiting for someone else to decide what mattered. There was only the woman who had returned and redrawn the line herself. She did not speak loudly, she did not turn to address the room, but her voice carried just enough to reach those who needed to hear it. "No one waits to be seen," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence held everything it needed to, because it was not a request, it was a standard, and standards do not depend on who is watching, they define what happens when no one is. Naomi stepped through the doors into the daylight outside, the air different, the noise of the city steady and indifferent to what had just changed inside. But inside the hospital something had shifted permanently, not because it had been forced, but because it had been revealed, and once something is seen clearly it cannot return to being ignored. The receptionist looked back at her terminal one last time before turning toward the next person in line, her voice quieter but grounded. "You are next," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no assumption, no delay, just acknowledgement. The intern continued moving through cases one by one, not faster, not slower, but more carefully, because speed was no longer the priority, accuracy was. The nurse adjusted her approach with each patient, no longer categorizing, no longer filtering, but listening fully, because listening had become part of the standard. The guard remained at his post, not enforcing distance but maintaining space where fairness could exist without interruption, and the executives finalized their reports, knowing that what had begun here would extend far beyond this building, into policies, into training, into decisions that would shape outcomes long after this moment passed. And Naomi Carter walked forward without looking back, not because it did not matter, but because it finally did. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded recognition. She had not needed to, because the truth had done what it always does when it is no longer contained. It changed everything, and somewhere behind her, inside a system that once measured who could wait and who could not, a new measure had taken its place, one that did not depend on appearance or assumption or quiet approval, but on something far simpler, something far stronger, something that should have always been there: care given when it is needed, without question, without delay, and without exception.